4 years, Jackson Cole lived in what many would call a dream, a life carved out of sweat, patience, and a relentless desire for solitude. His 120-acre ranch, nestled deep within the sprawling Oklahoma countryside, had been his personal fortress against the noise and chaos of the modern world. With no close neighbors, no traffic, and no one to answer to, Jackson cultivated a self-sustaining life, raising a few cattle, tending to an expansive vegetable garden, and finding peace in the rhythm of rural isolation. Every morning began with the quiet chirping of meadowlarks and the distant murmur of wind through the prairie grass. That all changed one unassuming Tuesday afternoon when he returned from a supply run in town to find a laminated paper sign affixed to his main gate. Bold red letters at the top read, "Notice of Non-Compliance, HOA District 27." Jackson froze. There were no HOAs out here. There never had been. This land had been in his family since the 1950s, far outside the jurisdiction of any neighborhood association. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. Maybe some overzealous bureaucrat misfiled paperwork. But as he read through the vague threats of fines and disciplinary actions for unauthorized livestock activity and non-standard roofing materials, a creeping unease settled into his chest. Something wasn't right. Within days, Jackson would come to know the name Karen Simmons, a woman who introduced herself as the acting president of the HOA and delivered her demands with the smug assurance of someone who believed the law bent to her whims. She was a peculiar figure, sharp-blazered even in 90-degree heat, always accompanied by a plastic folder stuffed with printed regulations and a Bluetooth earpiece that never seemed to be turned off. Karen drove a pearl-white SUV with darkened windows and bore the practiced smile of someone used to control, the kind that didn't need to make sense, only to be obeyed. Jackson had his first face-to-face with her when she parked at the end of his drive, stepping out uninvited to photograph his barn. When confronted, she coolly informed him he was in violation of HOA Ordinance 8.3c, an ordinance that didn't exist outside her paperwork. When Jackson calmly explained that his land wasn't under any HOA jurisdiction, she simply smirked and said, "That's what they all think. But you're in District 27 now. Check your deed." Her tone wasn't threatening, exactly, but it had an edge, something under the surface, like this was more than a misunderstanding. She handed him a neon-colored brochure detailing penalty tiers, and left without another word. From that point on, things escalated quickly. By the end of the week, strange individuals began appearing near the property line. Men and women in matching polo shirts marked with the stitched emblem HOA Patrol, holding clipboards and two-way radios. They paced the perimeter, jotting notes, taking photographs, occasionally ducking behind trees as if that would make them less conspicuous. Jackson watched through binoculars from his porch, anger rising like steam in his chest. One of them even had a badge clipped to his belt, though it bore no official seal, just the words, "Compliance Agent," and a barcode. When Jackson approached them, they claimed they were there to conduct a routine sweep for violations and would note any hostile behavior in their report. He demanded they leave immediately, reminding them they were trespassing. They did, but only for the afternoon. The next morning, he found zip ties on his fence posts, small markers tagged with strange numerical codes, and even a plastic evidence flag near his chicken coop. Someone was cataloging his property like it was part of a crime scene. One clipboard agent even tried to open the gate to his equipment shed, backing away only when Jackson raised his voice and placed his hand on the butt of his revolver. Whatever this HOA was, it wasn't just make-believe, it was organized, and it was invasive. Realizing the situation was spiraling into something beyond his own ability to contain, Jackson drove into town and requested a meeting with Deputy Langston, an old family friend and one of the few lawmen left who hadn't been pulled into the political tug-of-war over property lines and zoning regulations. Langston was skeptical at first, but when Jackson showed him photos of the so-called HOA Patrol and the fake compliance notices, his expression turned grim. "That's Karen Simmons, all right," he muttered, thumbing through the files. "She's been pulling this kind of crap for years. Most folks just cave or ignore her. You're the first I've heard of her trying to muscle in on land this far out." Langston explained that while Karen had no legal authority, no registered HOA, no permits, nothing, she was persistent, using fake documentation, intimidation, and a small network of loyal enforcers to create the illusion of power. She'd gotten some elderly residents to sign contracts under duress, using vague threats about taxes or property seizures. "She's a paper tyrant," Langston said. "Looks official, but it's all a shell. Problem is, once people believe it's real, she gets what she wants." Jackson's case was different though. remote, fortified, and occupied by someone who wasn't afraid to push back. Langston promised to keep an eye out, but warned, she won't stop just because the sheriff's office told her no. She's playing a longer game. True to Langston's warning, Karen escalated her tactics. Not even a week after their conversation, Jackson awoke to find his generator had been tampered with, wires cut clean, like with surgical shears. That night, Max, his loyal border collie, came limping to the front porch with glass embedded in his paw. Jackson followed the dog's trail back to a place where someone had dumped broken bottle shards near the western fence, hidden beneath loose leaves. It was no accident. This was harassment. He didn't wait. Jackson installed motion-activated floodlights, high-definition trail cams, and infrared motion sensors throughout the perimeter. By the third night, the cameras caught 2 of Karen's patrol members sneaking around the south fence with bolt cutters and what looked like a map of the property. Jackson printed the photos and handed them to Langston, who shook his head in disbelief. "This is turning into something bigger than her usual scam," he said. Jackson knew it too. The patrol wasn't just observing anymore, they were testing his limits, probing for weaknesses. If they were willing to sabotage equipment and injure animals, how far would they go? He spent every night after that with a shotgun at the ready and a live feed from his cameras playing on a monitor by his bedside. Sleep came in shallow bursts, broken by flickers of movement and the low whir of surveillance equipment. His peaceful ranch had become a war zone. The tension reached a boiling point on a fog-laced morning around 5:30 a.m. Jackson, half awake and nursing a thermos of coffee, caught an alert on his monitor. Multiple infrared signatures moving along the east tree line, too organized to be wildlife, too quiet to be coincidence. Then came the lights, beams slicing through the mist, glints of cheap tactical gear bouncing off camera lenses. They wore black outfits with HOA tactical unit ironed across their chests in white vinyl lettering, cheap knockoff body armor strapped over polos, and airsoft-grade helmets. A few carried what looked like rifles, though closer inspection later proved them to be paintball markers painted matte black. Jackson triggered his perimeter alarm with one tap, and floodlights exploded to life. Sirens howled from hidden speakers. The intruders froze, their illusion of authority shattering like glass underfoot. Jackson stepped out, shotgun in hand, backlit by his porch light, as Max barked like hellfire from the barn. Half the fake SWAT team scattered, stumbling over each other in a panic. The others weren't so lucky. Langston and 2 other deputies, already en route thanks to Jackson's earlier tip, intercepted them at the main road, detaining 3 who claimed they were authorized contractors performing civic duties. Their gear was confiscated, and their cell phones revealed encrypted group chats filled with logistics, shift rosters, and oddly cryptic phrases like OPRM Response Phase Alpha. Karen didn't show her face in person after that raid, but her influence lingered like a stain. Days later, bright red flyers began appearing on Jackson's mailbox, his fence, and even pinned to trees near the county road. Each one bore his face, a photo clearly pulled from his old driver's license, with the words, "NON compliant, high-risk citizen," stamped across the top. Below, in smaller font, was a series of accusations: unauthorized agricultural activity, refusal to participate in civic audits, and deliberate obstruction of regulatory harmonization. It would have been laughable if it weren't so effective. Jackson noticed a shift in how neighbors looked at him in town. At the feed store, 2 men who'd always chatted with him suddenly turned quiet. A woman he'd helped during a flood last year now crossed the street to avoid him. Karen had done more than trespass. She'd infected his reputation, weaponizing social pressure like a scalpel. She didn't need the law or brute force. She had perception. Jackson collected the flyers and brought them to Langston, but there was no clear charge to file. "She's not breaking a law by spreading rumors," the deputy said, frustration lining his voice. "But she's trying to isolate you. That's a classic tactic." Jackson knew this wasn't about compliance anymore. It was about erasing him from his own land, not physically, but psychologically. And that was far more dangerous. Everything changed the day Jackson received a manila envelope hand-delivered by someone in a brown suit with no name badge, who disappeared before Jackson could ask a question. Inside was a single folder marked RBM, Tier 3 Activation. Its contents were worse than he could have imagined. Documents detailed a program called Rural Behavioral Management, RBM, a federally funded initiative run under a black budget line, supposedly meant to soft integrate rural resistance communities into socio-legal conformity zones. The documents revealed that entities like Karen's HOA were fronts, civilian-facing enforcement mechanisms created to normalize incremental loss of autonomy through staged legal friction. Jackson flipped through pages describing simulated compliance interactions, prototype hostility simulations, and non-lethal conditioning via associative punishment. One section had a case file number, his, marked Live Observation, Subject 16A, HOA. It detailed everything: his past military service, his VA benefits, his history of political blog posts years ago criticizing federal land acquisition programs. He wasn't just being harassed. He was a test subject. Karen Simmons wasn't a lunatic. She was an operative, or at the very least, a contract actor working for something far more coordinated than a rogue HOA. Jackson felt the blood drain from his face. He wasn't paranoid. He was being watched, intentionally. Langston didn't hesitate. With the folder in hand, he brought the evidence to the county prosecutor, and within 48 hours, a judge signed off on a warrant. Karen's house was raided by local law enforcement and federal observers, a rare collaboration that revealed just how deep the rot went. Inside, authorities found an entire room converted into what looked like a behavioral lab, walls lined with whiteboards covered in psychological profiles, timelines, and maps of Jackson's property. There were surveillance logs tracking his daily movements, camera footage from drones, and stacks of printed communications referencing something called OPRM, Operational Psychological Resistance Management. They found fake uniforms, badge printers, dozens of fabricated notices, and an archive of phone recordings taken without consent. Perhaps most disturbing was a spreadsheet detailing over 20 individuals across the Midwest flagged as potential field test subjects. Jackson's name was highlighted in yellow, with a note, resistance level elevated, escalation successful. Karen was taken into custody on charges ranging from criminal impersonation to conspiracy to commit psychological coercion. But for Jackson, there was no celebration. There was only confirmation that his nightmare had a blueprint, and that others were next. The calm didn't last. 2 weeks after Karen's arrest, a black SUV with no plates was spotted idling near the western fence line. Then came another group, this time armed with real weapons, not paintball gear. They approached at dawn, moving in a staggered formation like trained paramilitary. Jackson was ready. He'd upgraded his defenses: tripwire flares, automated spotlight turrets, and reinforced blinds for all windows. When the intruders breached the fence, the traps went off. Flares hissed into the sky. Sirens screamed. A strobe of disorientation blanketed the field, and Jackson, using a scoped rifle loaded with beanbag rounds, neutralized 2 intruders before Langston's team, who'd been monitoring for potential retaliation, arrived in force. The standoff ended quickly. All 7 intruders were detained. One carried a laminated document labeled Seizure Protocol, Tier 2 Engagement, authorizing the neutralization and repossession of non-compliant assets. They were heavily armed and wore black tactical suits with no insignia. When questioned, one detainee broke under pressure and asked, "Did Subject 16A breach protocol already? We thought he was still in behavioral conditioning." That single sentence sent a chill through everyone in the interrogation room. This wasn't just a rogue action. This was a multi-phase operation. And Jackson, unknowingly, had become the center of something far larger than his land. The interrogations continued over several days. Most of the detainees refused to speak or claimed ignorance, but one, a younger man with visible bruising and shaking hands, finally cracked under pressure. He wasn't military. He wasn't law enforcement. He was a paid contractor, recruited through what he described as a compliance transition program, advertised as a community safety initiative. He claimed he'd only been briefed on a few layers of the operation but heard whispers of something called Phase 4. According to him, Jackson wasn't just a subject, he was the prototype. The government, or some off-books division of it, had been using these experimental HOA-style control systems as test runs for broader population management strategies in high-autonomy rural zones. The plan wasn't just to erode individual sovereignty through pseudo-legal means, it was to normalize compliance through artificial governance models. If Jackson's resistance proved manageable, Phase 4 would be initiated in multiple test states. "You weren't supposed to hold out this long," the man muttered. They thought your profile would collapse after Tier 2 isolation. But you held. That messed up the metrics. It was an admission that chilled Jackson more than any fake uniform or midnight raid. He hadn't just been resisting harassment. He'd been fighting the beta version of an authoritarian framework dressed in neighborhood bureaucracy. With Langston's help and a growing network of sympathetic legal contacts, Jackson went public. He compiled the folder Karen had given him, the documents seized during the raid, and his own years of video surveillance, and sent them anonymously to a group of independent journalists and congressional watchdogs. Within weeks, stories began surfacing about OPRM, Operational Psychological Resistance Management, a program so deeply buried in bureaucratic camouflage that even FOIA requests came back redacted or non-existent. But Jackson had something they didn't: first-hand evidence. His ranch became a flashpoint, a case study in government overreach disguised as civic enforcement. He even gave a closed-door testimony before a Senate subcommittee, detailing the non-lethal warfare used against him on domestic soil. The backlash was immediate. Karen Simmons was officially indicted on 17 counts, including conspiracy against civil rights, criminal impersonation of law enforcement, and unlawful surveillance. But the federal charges stalled. Jackson suspected stonewalling, or worse, containment. Several journalists who had requested deeper files received cease and desist letters. One independent blogger who published satellite photos of similar-looking HOA districts in Colorado and Missouri disappeared from social media entirely. Jackson realized he may have lit the match, but the fire would need more than one man to spread after the dust settled. Jackson tried to return to his life, or what remained of it. The ranch was scarred, not just physically, but spiritually. His land, once a symbol of peace and autonomy, now felt exposed. Though the cameras remained and his defenses were stronger than ever, the feeling of safety had been permanently altered. Karen's operation was dismantled, but the files recovered from her home, and later decoded by civilian cybersecurity experts, told a broader story. Encrypted folders referenced other active cells: Midwest Beta, Pacific Integration, Ozark Nesting. One document listed budget allocations that didn't match any known government program. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were trial runs. Jackson shared everything he could, even as the press began to move on to the next story. People wanted closure. They wanted a bad guy in cuffs, a clean resolution. But Jackson knew better. He'd seen the iceberg beneath the surface. Karen Simmons was never the head of the snake. She was the fanged smile they sent to keep people compliant while something colder and more calculated moved behind the curtain. There were still moments, especially in the dead of night, when Jackson felt watched. Drones no longer buzzed over his field, but he noticed cars slowing down on the back road more often. Once he found a business card wedged into the gate with no name, only a barcode and the phrase, "Still watching." He reported it, but there was nothing anyone could do. No fingerprints. No footage. Just a reminder. Langston had his own run-ins too: an unmarked black SUV parked outside his home, strange errors in his department's database files. Whatever OPRM was, it hadn't been dismantled. It had only restructured. Jackson reinforced his perimeter, added offline power backups, and began training with former contractors who offered to help, quietly, off-grid. He didn't trust many people anymore. He couldn't afford to. He wasn't paranoid, he was prepared. He knew what the world didn't want to believe: systems of control don't die when exposed. They adapt. They go quieter. Smarter. Deeper. He could feel the hum of something still moving beneath the surface, a machine not yet finished, and the final entry of the log Jackson posted anonymously to a secure forum. He left a chilling conclusion: this wasn't about one ranch, one program, or one corrupt woman with delusions of power. This was about control. Slow, quiet, engineered control that looks like safety. If you see signs of it, sudden rule changes, unrecognized jurisdictions, behavioral monitoring under the guise of community, don't ignore them. Don't wait for proof. Act. Investigate. Expose. Because if they've already mapped your neighborhood, if you're already listed as a potential subject, it means it's already started. The question isn't whether they'll come. It's whether you'll be ready when they do. And then, silence. The forum post was taken down 3 days later. No user trace. No metadata. But it had already been archived and reposted across dozens of survivalist and civil rights networks. Jackson's message had reached its audience, those on the fringes, those already uneasy, those who knew. And somewhere out there, in a bunker of digital whispers and quiet resolve, resistance quietly began to organize. Not out of fear, but out of understanding that the greatest threat to freedom isn't the knock on the door.